All right, you happily, you joyously miserable accursed. Scott and I are back here with Lisa Raitt, who is a verifiable hit on our podcast based on the 99.8% positive feedback we received on the Twitter machine. For further proof, we have Bill 5626 chiming in on Apple Rate and Review with, "I love this podcast. Scott is hilarious, and I love his critique of his own side. Especially love when Lisa Raitt is on, despite me being pretty liberal. Highly recommend. We appreciate you, liberal Bill 5626, because you're perceptive and also because you expressed your love 3 times in 2 sentences. Okay, let's get to today's topics. The North American EV provision. That's a win for this government, right? There are fresh numbers from Abacus to talk about. Are they shocking numbers for Trudeau or just what you'd expect mid-cycle poll? More interesting to me are the global numbers for is this country headed in the wrong direction? They're the same in every country. Why is this the case and how do politicians navigate that environment? Our cursed clipping is Andrew Coyne's in defense of the deep state. Why democratic rule doesn't mean letting politicians run everything. And as we do, we'll close the show with Pinsentian Gravitas with our Hey Yous. Lisa, Scott, great to have you guys here.
Good to be back.
Hey, Lisa, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Are you a Jason Isabel fan?
A who?
Jason Isabel. Former drive-by trucker, solo artist now. David is sporting a Jason Isbell jersey. We took him to see Jason Isbell in upstate New York for his 60th birthday. 60.
Nice.
David's 60 years old.
Nice.
They still let me into a rock concert. Can you believe
older
that?
than Slate Rock. Anyway, we're big Jason Isbell fans.
Well, I knew, one of the things that I think about before I come on the show with you guys is, do I have any rock t-shirt paraphernalia to wear? And sadly, no. I'm not. I have a fiddler behind me, though. Do you see him?
We're gonna hook you
little
up.
wood carving of a fiddler. That's as close to music as I could find in my house. So there you go.
Is that based
If you
on a
were going to
specific
wear,
person?
if you were going to wear a rock t-shirt, what would you wear?
What would I wear? If I were to wear a rock
You
t-shirt.
can't say the Eagles. I just want to let you know before you speak.
Well, I don't know what rock is anymore, so I'm going to go safe and say U2. But you know what? I'm loving Lizzo right now, so I would really proudly wear a Lizzo t-shirt.
Absolutely.
Right.
The new album is terrific.
Yeah.
The new album is terrific. I'm
Take a
not
move.
listening to it as much as the new Beyonce, which is also terrific, by the way.
My kids tell me it's great.
Yeah. Get out on the dance floor, Lisa. Get out on the dance floor with
that's true.
Beyonce. All right, you made it to Cape Breton?
I did. Yeah, I did. I drove through our wonderful, beautiful country. I really enjoyed the 2-day drive, I have to say, by myself with I listened to a couple of your podcasts where I could, and it was very relaxing. A good way to kind of, disconnect from your normal daily life. So I'm happy to be here. Just arrived, and like everybody who has a secondary residence in a cottage country, or you help somebody with a cottage country place, I have a lot of crap to do. Oh my God, I have a lot of crap to do. I got leaking pipes. I got lots going on here.
They're nothing but work. Scott, I saw on the social media that you were up at your family cottage this weekend.
On the social media. Yeah, I was. Yeah. And it was, boy, things change, eh? Like this weekend, I had only one. So like, Lisa, I don't think you know this. I have 77 sons by 78 women, and I had only one of them. So that was my modest contribution to the weekend.
But the hardest one.
There were 9. He's such a crazy, strange kid. But there were 9 kids. So it's 2 cottages built by my great grandfather. My cousins got one. Me and my mother share one, and then like. My mom was an only child. I was an only child for acres of time. There were no other children at the cottage, just me wandering around, reading, books and
making sense now to me. This is all making sense.
That's right. Well, that's where my pathologies all began. And then, and now my cousin's children all have children. And now there were 9 kids at the cottage this weekend. It was insane. It was like water wings and popsicles and s'mores. It was pretty fun.
I have a term for that. Bad weekend.
Bad weekend.
Bad weekend. 9 kids
fun.
at the cottage.
No, I'm here. Same. Here for all the cousins. Just put the kids all together and let them go.
So listen, you obviously both had a lot of time to think. You were driving across the country and you were trying to avoid 9 kids. Either of you running for the Green Party leadership? I'm thinking about it.
I'm giving it a whirl. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to co-lead. I was sitting around thinking to myself, I don't want to do the job full time. If I could just find someone that was willing to take up, I'd like to do the back shop stuff. Like if somebody was willing to go on TV, participate in the leaders debate, get the glory. If I could get someone to handle that, then I could sit in the background and argue with the council and try to maybe raise money or something like that. That would be a good gig. And then lo and behold, Elizabeth May steps forward. And I think, Jesus is the answer to my prayers.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't run because I can't take the eventual character assassination that happens with the Green Party of their leader.
No, stick with the pod. It's coming.
They're crazy, those people that run that party. Who the hell are they? Like, they set out these criteria for the leadership that were almost impossible for anybody to meet. And then the leader, once elected, has to report to the council and run everything by the council. You're not the leader. You're like the council's representative or something. It's impossible to continue to take these people seriously, I have to say.
Well, we have a national council in the Conservative Party, and the role of the leader is to make sure that national council understands what's going on, and it's grassroots based, and it works because you have a strong leader who can work with the national council. And in the case of the Green Party, that doesn't seem to happen. The leaders are coming from one pot of people, and the national council is coming from another pot of people, and they may not actually be copacetic with one another. That's my observation. I don't know anything about it.
Is it that binary though? Because now, literally, I actually lump Elizabeth May, and I like Elizabeth May. We all know her, I'm sure. I'm sure you must know her well, Lisa. And I think we all...
Well, you had a famous moment with her.
Yeah.
At the Parliamentary Press Gallery dinner.
Yeah, and I blame Bob Ray. I blame Bob Ray for that. Because he looked at me and he said, "What are you going to do, Ray?" It's like, okay, I guess I'm going up on stage.
Going up.
Here I go.
Going up into the dunk tank. But don't you think, I think among the things that make the party at this point in its history sort of risible and unprofessional is the fact that she's saying, well, I might come back and run in the face of all these sort of internal divisions, inability to define what it wants to be going forward, internal fire. And then she says, I'm going to run for the leadership. I'll return to it, but only if I can have the job on a part-time basis. None of it makes any sense. And I have trouble, therefore, even figuring out what the factions are. Like, were they all May people, or because I don't get the feeling that it's necessarily a big May conspiracy, but you get the sense that there's, true believers, and then there's people who are pragmatic, and then there's May people. I just can't figure any of it out. It looks like a dog's breakfast.
But there is one reality, right? She is the most talented political person in that party. She may not be talented enough. She may be used up. She may be past her best before date, but she's the only person that I've seen in that party that can get anybody excited about anything.
Federally, I'm going to say that provincially, there are some stars in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and in Ontario.
I was talking federally. Yeah.
But and that's the point, though. I mean, where it works, their message really works if you have the right mix of the candidate plus the situation and the circumstance, and you can win ridings like Guelph, like in Ontario, or you can win in Fredericton, and that to me would give a shining beacon of hope for the Green Party that provided they get it together and they get it right, they really could put a dent into some serious ridings across the country.
What
and
a
going
moment
back
they're
in time
missing.
to Liz May. Yeah, exactly.
What
going
a
back
moment.
In time, Liz May doesn't do it. Yeah.
But, I don't even, the notion she's the most talented asset they have, that is probably a statement of fact, but it's also a condemnation because, it serves to prove the point about the National Council and the infrastructure they've established and how inadequate it is. Because I guess obviously the signal that talented people are receiving is not wanted, right? And so don't go into these crazy waters. You're going to get sunk. And, because there's just I don't believe that it's impossible to attract people that would be aligned to what I think the Green Party would be notionally standing for, who might be super talented and could do some real damage, and not just even having to draw on some of the provincial folks. I'm sure there's a lot of talent out there, and you just get the feeling that people look at it and they go, well, this is like an intramural thing. This is student council, and I don't want to be part of it because I'm not best friends with Becky, and Becky, used to go out with Biff, and Biff doesn't want anything to do with, and they're all friends of Liz May, and so just stay out. And who's who's interested in a half-time job as the other part of the leadership?
Well, it's interesting that Glenn Murray, who got roasted in their last leadership, is cruising to be the mayor of Winnipeg. Right?
Again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Scrutiny, evidence, measurement of the things we do to make sure the things we do actually work. Hurly-burlyites, don't these concepts apply to, well, just about everything we need to operate smoothly in our lives? And lately you may have noticed a lot of media attention, government scrutiny, and dinner table conversations combing through the evidence and best practices about how telecommunications networks are built and how they operate in Canada. On behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS, I'm here to tell you that evidence-based decision-making, deep dives into best practices, and high levels of scrutiny also need to be present in how we divvy up and deploy spectrum in this country. Without spectrum, those invisible data-carrying radio waves that make your smartphone smart, networks do not run. Spectrum is fundamental to how all of us thrive, whether we live in big cities or rural communities. And yet, today, we don't take full advantage of the policy tools and the evidence to make sure we're getting these policies right. Sounds shocking, I know, but we don't sufficiently measure the progress, impact, or successes of our spectrum policies. So, here are 2 ways forward from TELUS. Before any policy decision is made, all spectrum consultation should include a rigorous economic analysis carried out by an independent third party, so decision makers, stakeholders, and all Canadians can accurately assess its broader impacts. Following a policy decision, a performance measurement framework should be administered by Statistics Canada, updated every 2 years, with an additional substantive report on policy impacts 5 years after each spectrum auction. It's a constantly evolving wireless world, hurly-burlyites. Flawless connectivity is ever more crucial to our economy, our healthcare, our education, our climate, everything. You may never think about the details of spectrum, but you feel it in your everyday. We'll continue this story next week. Hey kids, the mood of this country is really black right now. Abacus data had a poll out this past week. Bad numbers for Trudeau, his highest negative since Abacus has been tracking, and that got a lot of attention, deservedly so. But I was also interested in the number of Canadians who feel the country's headed in the wrong direction. Just 33% of Canadians, just 1/3, think the country is headed in the right direction. That's down 8 points from March. The attitude of the U.S. and other democracies is even worse. I think in the States, it's about 20% who feel their country is headed in the right direction. What do you think is going on, Lisa? Why is everybody so black?
I think it comes down to affordability. I really do. I think there was a great time of hope back in 2015, and everybody voted in that way and expected to change. Pandemic wasn't helpful. It locked people away for a long period of time. They were able to save some money during pandemic, but when they came out, they discovered we can't spend it, and what we have isn't enough to get what we thought we wanted. People made some big life choices in terms of where they're going to live or how they're going to live, and now they're expected to go back to what was the norm. It's a time of flux. It's a time of uncertainty, and people are overall, I think, uncomfortable with their situation, so they're going to blame the government. And I'm not surprised that it's happening, but I am concerned about the outward expression of it and the way that they're expressing it, because, social media is a cesspool, no matter which platform you're on. And people are very confrontational and very, very, very critical. I've been watching Twitter lately because
always a joyous experience.
Yeah,
not Twitter. Sorry, other one, not Twitter. TikTok. I've been watching TikTok.
Oh.
And the amount of, somehow in my algorithm, I found myself into the side of TikTok that has people complaining about living in Ontario, and it's late 20s, early 30-year-old people like crying on TikTok saying, I can't afford to live here anymore. I can't do what I want to do. Now, I mean, as a Gen Xer, I say, well, you can't eat out every night, guys. You can't go to clubs all the time. Those $14 lattes are going to come and hit you at some point in time. But that's not their lifestyle. They've grown up very differently and they want to preserve what they have. And they're being told, you got to go back to the way it was in the mid 80s. And I think it's a huge backlash, and they're vocal.
Interesting. Scott, what's your take on why people are really feeling that things are going wrong?
Well, I agree, obviously, with everything Lisa said. I think you come out of the pandemic, which created enormous discomfort for people, right? Like a real sense of anxiety and insecurity. Insecurity from a personal health standpoint for some people. Many people to this day, and possibly for very good reasons. I'm not trying to belittle them or marginalize them. Are anxious about, I don't want to go in a grocery store. I don't want to go to a movie theater. I don't want to be on a subway. So, you've got that, but you've got economic insecurity and anxiety coming out of the pandemic. Then it's compounded by what just seems like a waterfall of shit news. Like so war in Ukraine, gas prices, knock-on effects, food prices. We're overwhelmed by evidence that climate change is not just happening, but it's happening, and it's a punishing thing. It's not a natural development or evolution. It's just like it's resulting in fires and tornadoes and floods and misery. And so I think people are just cascaded with terrible news. And so So I think all of that is kind of understandable about why people are in a bad mood. And we're confronted with challenges that we haven't seen in 40 years. So in many respects, people thought that those things were gone. They thought that those ills were cured. Inflation is economic portfolio. We thought it was gone. We thought it was conquered. And now it's back. And so I think when you put all that together with the fact that polio does actually appear to be back, people are in a pretty grim, anxious place, and they're looking for their leaders for leadership. And I think that's really where it gets interesting, because the question is, do you look at the numbers you're pointing out, David, in terms of right direction, wrong direction, and look across multiple jurisdictions and say to yourself, well, the lesson here is that there's almost nothing governments can do about it. They're just going to get blamed because it's happening on their watch, and that's all there is to it. And I think it's more complicated. I think there's also I think there's one further characteristic that's shared, at least by, I'd say, governments in the UK, Canada, and the United States, which is that you've got incumbent leadership that's inconsistent in its effort to give voice and to reflect that anxiety. So it's so afraid, right? I think leaders are so afraid of saying, you're hurting and you're anxious, and we get that. And they're so afraid of that, right? Instead, there's that incumbent impulse to say, let's tell people, here's what the good news is. Like, let's get out on a social media account for the prime minister or the president. Tell them, oh, you know what? Gas prices have actually dropped by 12 cents. And let's tell them that, this is what's happening. And so there's this impulse to diminish, deflect, all that. And so what people see is a government that's not seized with these issues to the degree that they are. And I think that harms. And so I don't think the failure is the government doesn't have a 5-point plan that will fix everything, because nobody does. But I think the failure is that governments look like they are schizophrenic in their approach to recognizing these challenges and saying, these things that have gripped you around the throat and are causing you to be worried are the exact same things that dominate us. And again, I go to it. You want evidence of what I'm saying? Look at the prime minister's tour. And I don't blame him for where he's gone and what he's done, but there's no thematic emphasis and re-emphasis on economic anxiety, on affordability, on trying to build a plan that
quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. It seems like it's counter-programming. And I think that's a problem. And I think if you look at Biden, you see almost the exact same thing. So I think governments feel like, to people, they're not responding to this tidal wave of anxiety.
And no matter what good Trudeau thought he was doing by cramming all of these small town whistle stop visits, he eradicated all that goodwill with 1 2-week trip to Costa Rica, jetting off. Yeah, 100%.
I'm not as damning about that. I don't blame him. I think if you got the other stuff right, people wouldn't.
They always do. They always do.
It is what it is, right? You're always going to get shit for taking a vacation.
Harper always said, I'm going to vacation within Canada because the backlash is there.
You'll still get shit, though, to be like, what's he doing in Whistler, having fun?
I don't know. Not a lot of people can think about going to Costa Rica.
I want to bring it back to this in a different way. In my years of polling, I would say that the number of people who say the country's headed in the right direction is the ceiling of support for the incumbent government. So forget your current polls about who people would vote for.
The ceiling.
Forget your favorability, unfavorability of the leader. Right direction, wrong direction. Not many people who think the country's headed in the wrong direction vote for the incumbent government. Almost all of your support comes from people who think the country's headed in the right direction. If that's only 33%, you can't find enough. Now, in this days of polarization, that may be a little bit different. There may be people that say, I'm unhappy with the way the country's going, but I can't go to Weve, or in the States, I can't go to the Republicans. But still, this is a very shrunken universe for incumbent governments to be seeking votes in.
I'm surprised, David. I thought you would say it's the floor of support. Like you've hit the bottom. Like those are I was thinking to myself, is that 30% the hardcore Trudeau voters that are saying it's in the right direction? So, I mean, your observation is really interesting.
Well, there'll be New Democrats in there who think things are going in the right direction. There'll be Bloc who think things are going in the right direction. You're still competing with other parties for that vote. But the people who think things are going in the wrong direction are thinking about another party other than the governing party.
I don't know. But provincially, out in BC, the NDP have a big lead over Liberals. And in Ontario, the incumbent won. I don't know.
Well, maybe the provinces aren't being blamed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. Provinces may not be.
Yeah.
And it may be that it takes a little while. You got trickle down politics. It takes a while for it to trickle to the provincial level. Like I think in Ontario, you are going to see numbers start to turn. You just like it feels like we're in a suspended circumstance for the summer with the Ford government coming off a big victory and all of that. But you're seeing the crisis, and I think it's virtually a crisis in hospitals and emergency rooms. And I just don't think that can sustain for week after week without it starting to take a bite out. But you get back to the feds, like, I mean, doesn't that also, it tells you if 33 is your ceiling, then one of two things is going to happen. The ceiling's going to come, it's going to lower, or it's going to rise, right? Like, I mean, it's not likely this is, where it's going to be whenever the next election is. So, you obviously have to say to yourself, what do I do? And I think you have to do two things. And I've been kind of barking on this for a long time. One, you have to take steps that demonstrate to people that you're responding to the things that concern them in a more clear way, in a way that breaks through with people. So that's bread and butter economic issues. And two, you've got to sharpen the unattractiveness of the alternative by reminding people that Pierre Poilievre is going to win this leadership, and this is what he's all about. Because he's not going to tell you that he has a bunch of deficiencies. He's likely to tell you that the government's deficient and that he's better. So I come back to it. I think there's a double-barreled response to this, and I don't see the government throwing either barrel out there.
It is it's just axiomatic. Just if I could just throw this in, Lisa, that when. It's always true in a late-term government, but especially with numbers like this in the country, that if the Liberals win re-election, it's because they destroyed Poilievre.
Right.
Yeah. I've been, in my long drive out here, what I was thinking about was promises made during COVID. And one of the speaking points for the Liberal government was, we got your back. We have your back. We have your back. And to Scott's point, boy, people do not feel like the government has their back right now at all, especially with inflation. I mean, to say that the supply chain is a worldwide phenomenon, to say inflation's a worldwide phenomenon, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when you are watering down your milk, and it doesn't matter when you're worried about whether or not you're going to be able to pay for your energy, heat, whatever, this winter. They don't have your back. And it's a promise made and a promise not kept. And those things, I think, are really harmful in politics.
No doubt. All right.
I know I get a lot of nasty notes from Liberals, but I really do these days. But I think it's even worse than that, because I think it's that I think we've got your back was maybe the most successful unofficial slogan politically since Yes We Can. Like, I think it was really resonant with people in the pandemic, particularly in the early days. It was the right note. And I don't think that people feel it's translated into the economic issues. And I think that the government, to make it worse, I really believe, if you watch carefully, I think the government thinks that actually it's making progress that's not yet recognized by Canadians. So I think they think they're on the right track. So you've got this massive dissonance. I think they look at it and we see interest rates starting to have a trickle-through effect. Yes, we're going to have to manage a recession. Let's make sure it's a soft landing one. But housing prices are coming down. Then that's going to increase affordability, which, by the way, doesn't follow. It actually makes carrying costs higher. But then, and then we're going to see other corrections, and supply chains are going to get better, and gas prices are starting to shift, and we're going to actually see that the world will knit itself back together. And I really think that there's a notion of things are quietly improving, and they will continue to quietly improve, and eventually we'll get credit for that. So stiff upper lip, stay calm, carry on, this kind of stuff that governments tell themselves. And I think they're just walking into a wood chipper.
They are, because their talking points for the summer, for this week, is we're going to buy back your handguns. And that just surprised me. Of anything that you're talking, I mean, yeah, you want to put money in pockets, but of all the things to start pushing in August, it was odd.
Yeah. Scott, another week went by and your hey you to Minister Freeland was ignored. Yet again, another week of complete and utter silence out of the Minister of Finance.
Well, I mean, it's last week of July. I assume she's taken some time, which I don't begrudge her. But I'll I go back to what I said the other day. If she's taken time off, fine. Come back with a new plan. Come back with a new tune, and start whistling loudly, because it's not working.
So last year was just lousy for Canada's grain farmers. Annus horribilis, as the Queen would say. The first drought in 20 years reduced the crop by nearly 40%, tens of millions of tons. At the same time, extreme heat and fires last summer in British Columbia delivered a shocking blow to rail service. Something called an atmospheric river then followed up, washing out railroad tracks in BC and at one point effectively turning the lower mainland into an island. After all that came one of the most severe winters we've ever experienced, during which Russia invaded Ukraine, another giant grain producer, disrupting markets worldwide. Like I said, lousy. Now, the industry is looking forward to a new crop. So is our sponsor, CN, which happens to be the biggest single mover of Canadian grain. Every year, the railway produces an official grain plan. This year's just came out. CN is forecasting a rebound, and the railway has spent a lot of money in the past year to prepare for it. It's bought new locomotives and added to its fleet of high-efficiency, high-capacity hopper cars, and spent hundreds of millions upgrading its tracks and bridges and crossings. So CN is as ready as it can possibly be for the new grain crop, within human limits. Plainly, the climate is changing, producing events that cannot be overcome. There's a reason for the term force of nature. That said, the railway is suggesting that one way to cope with the risk of extreme weather is to spread out shipments, send grain west and east. Right now, the industry ships most of its grain to ports on the west coast, creating the vulnerability we witnessed last year, when most of the extreme weather was in British Columbia. Meanwhile, eastern ports like Thunder Bay, Montreal, and Quebec City all have capacity to handle more grain efficiently. It only makes sense that we take advantage of them. With the situation in Ukraine, Canada's farmers are more than ever responsible for feeding the world, and CN wants to move the new crop as efficiently as possible, which might mean working around extreme weather rather than trying to work through it. Hey, you know what we do on this show? We have a clipping. We take a news clipping and we talk about it every week. Isn't that something? Anyway, so our clipping this week comes to us courtesy of Andrew Coyne and the Globe and Mail. In a stirring defense of the deep state, he makes the argument that many decisions need to be removed from direct political control. Here's a sample. It is an elementary principle of democracy that the people we elect to run things should not, in fact, run things. They should, as the phrase has it, steer but not row, set the broad direction of policy, but not involve themselves in the details of its implementation. And yet this basic principle of democratic governance seems to elude a great many people on both sides of the political divide. Whether it's Conservatives proposing to override the Supreme Court or fire the Bank of Canada governor, or Liberals messing with an independent prosecutor, or the scandal du jour, an RCMP investigation, supporters' reaction to criticism is always the same. He's the Prime Minister. He's elected. They're not. Who are these unelected elites, the gatekeepers, the deep state, and other epithets, to stand in the way of our elected leaders? So the Prime Minister ruffled a few bureaucratic feathers. That's democracy. No. Democratic government means an executive that is accountable and rules-based, that abides by the rules it sets for itself, not an executive that can act in whatever arbitrary or despotic way it likes by appealing to popular will. Lisa, does he have this right?
Look, I don't like criticizing Andrew Coyne because
It's dangerous.
He writes for a newspaper and all. What I would say is my experience has been that the federal bureaucracy very much adheres to the adage that they will fearlessly advise and faithfully implement. And I think that's exactly what this is supposed to be. It's give the best advice that you possibly can to the people who were elected. And then once a decision is made, after careful consideration, after discussions with deputy ministers, after looking at all the options, that they go ahead and implement. And I think that is right. And deep state is such a weird term in Canada because our bureaucracy doesn't change. It's there. It's not like the United States where people come in and out according to the political will of the day. Our guys are the deep state. They're there all the time. And I'm glad that they're there all the time because they give good advice. And I think where they're failing is the implementation side. And I think still it's a hangover from Gomery where any bureaucrat who was at least a little bit of risk appetite firmly has eradicated that desire to take any risk within their career whatsoever to make things move faster. And that's a shame. That's a shame because that chill, I think, really does hurt us on innovation and on moving things quickly and on reacting to circumstances. Selina Cesar-Chavannes was on a radio talk show this morning because she unfortunately received not great, I would say, reception at Parliament, despite the fact that she was wearing her parliamentary pin. She was still put through security and treated as if she was faking the pin, I suppose. And she went and talked to the inclusivity officer who was appointed in September of 2021, and they only have a draft report. And she said, that's just unacceptable. I mean, the person's almost been in for a full year. That to me is a great example of the inability to move quickly and to make decisions within government, waiting for somebody else to come down and tell them whether yay or nay. So I don't know if I answered your question. I kind of rambled on, but I don't think I'm agreeing with Coyne. But I do see that there's a problem with our officials not having a greater risk appetite, unless you're the commissioner of the RCMP, where you took a great risk.
Scott, there was a meeting of our transition team in 2003, and we were meeting with the clerk and his assistant. His assistant's the wrong word. She was a senior bureaucrat herself, but she was assisting him in the transition. And there was a deputy minister that it was an article of faith in our world was going to be moving or leaving. And I mentioned this in the transition meeting, that of course that deputy would be not in that position. And the clerk's 2IC took me aside out of the meeting and said, you don't speak to the clerk that way. You don't tell the clerk who's going to be a deputy minister in what position. That is the clerk's decision. Right. That was my first surprise about the power of the bureaucracy.
Well, I think there's more than we've migrated this discussion into just a discussion of the federal civil service, and I think that may be too narrow because I think that Andrew's column was more broad, and it was particularly about institutions of government, possibly peopled with senior civil servants, but that are notionally independent of government. So things like the Bank of Canada, CRTC, so on and so forth, those kinds of institutions, and the virtue of having them be operating independent. The question is, I think, really interesting, because this column makes me uncomfortable, because I agree emphatically with some of it in principle, and I don't agree with parts of it. And then finally, I worry that it actually feeds the bonfire of the opposite side of this argument. So by that, I mean this. I think it's important when we're going to talk about the virtues of having a civil service, or particularly certain agencies that were created as a matter of virtue and deliberate virtue to be independent of government. I think it's important that we talk about what we mean by independence. I think you want to have those organizations and the leadership of those organizations be independent from partisanship. I don't think that means that they can be, or they necessarily ought to be, independent of politics. And I think people conflate those terms all the time. I want people who are running the Bank of Canada. I want the governor of the Bank of Canada, or the head of the CRTC for that matter. I want them to have an acute sense of politics, because they live in a fundamentally political environment where politicians and political forces affect the decisions they make and ought to affect the decisions they make. They need to calibrate the politics of the moment. Now, maybe they'll do that well or poorly. I don't know. What I don't want them to do is to be acting in concert with partisan impulse. Because then I think that means that they're putting a thumb on the scale, and they're allowing their decision to be guided by non-transparent and poor factors. So, for example, where I agree with Andrew strongly is that our institutions are under attack, and they're coming under attack. They're coming under vicious and direct attack, and I think pejorative and often false attack from the likes of Poilievre in particular. Let's just personify it around him, right? Our institutions are failing us. They're letting us down. You can't trust them. And if they don't do what I say, then they're wrong. And that, to me, is a dangerous thing. It shows a disregard for those institutions. And some of them must operate with a degree of independence, because they can't simply be directed by partisan instinct. Presumably, the governor of the Bank of Canada will receive no criticism from Pierre Poilievre, provided he implements an agenda that Pierre Poilievre agrees with. That's partisan. If the governor recognizes that there are political implications of interest rate decisions and of quantitative easing and all these things, and those are calibrated into their decisions, possibly even addressed and articulated, and say, this is how I understand public opinion and what the effects it's going to have, but I got to tell you, we still nevertheless believe that this is the right decision, then to me, that's smart management, that's smart leadership. And so I agree with Andrew about the fact that our institutions are under attack, and that a whole pile of things get conflated. And frankly, it is driving toward, let's partisanize any element of government whatsoever under the notion of, well, it must be electorally accountable, and only I as an elected official represent that accountability. And if you don't do what I say, then therefore you're wrong. That to me is a bad place. But I think we got to be very careful about entrusting overly in those institutions, and saying, well, they just get to operate as completely free riders. Notionally, people say always that the virtue of the public service, it's there to challenge. It serves a challenge function. Government says we want to do this, and the challenge function from the civil service to say, well, not sure you can get away with that, or here are going to be a bunch of unintended consequences. Have you thought that through? It's not to say don't do it, it's to challenge. I find sometimes in the practice of government, the political level must challenge the bureaucracy just as much. When the bureaucracy comes back and says this is not doable or this is not desirable, say, well, actually, let's challenge that idea. Let's challenge that. And so it's best if there's an open dialogue. You can have that open dialogue if there's mistrust, fear, and an environment. If you don't follow my partisan lead, then you're going to lose your job. And I think that's where Poilievre is taking us, and why Andrew has a point.
You know, I'm a little confused by your point, because I'm fine with third-party accountability in areas where there is clear expertise that is required to do that job. And take something like the Bank of Canada. I don't think anybody in the government would have any idea what they were doing. The Bank of Canada is a specialized expertise. But when you get into the realm of what are really political choices, like, people always like to talk about taking decision-making out of the politicians' hands and giving it to others. Like, give you an example. The Canada Foundation for Innovation that Paul set up, Scott, right?
Yep.
So that the decision-making about where that money goes is taken out of politicians' hands. Well, why? Why is that a good thing? Why? Who's better qualified to make those decisions than the people that were elected?
The only reason we did that, let's be honest, the reason we did that, there are two reasons, actually, I guess. One was it had an accounting benefit, if we want to be honest about it, right? Like, one, we had enough money that we didn't want it to just simply go according to rules of the day to debt if we hadn't spent it by the end of the year. We wanted to preserve it and allow it to be used as capital or operating over a longer period of time. And the federal balance sheet didn't really permit that. So one, there was an accounting reason, which was part of the criticism at the time, and that was a fair criticism. The other reason is that we recognized even then that there was skepticism about institutions. And we were, in effect, validating and recognizing that and saying, well, if we create this thing that's independent, that's not contaminated by all of these factors, then perhaps you'll get better decisions. And in that weird way, we played into the played into the cynicism.
You know, when you come from places like Cape Breton or Saskatchewan, politics is the only way you get things sometimes. Because the high and mighty central Canadians that tend to be the arbiters of these things don't think about Cape Breton or Saskatchewan very much.
So to that point, I was just thinking to myself, why would you want to have an independent agency that is not directed by politicians? And it's because sometimes subject matter knowledge on a local level is exactly what is needed in order to get things done. I think about a COA, for example, or I think about one of the Western Economic Regional Development Agencies who know what's going on the ground, and politicians just don't, quite frankly. So if we're not talking about the federal bureaucracy, which I would agree is, in terms of who gets what position, it's very different because the clerk does choose, maybe in consultation with, but the clerk does choose. So let's flip over to the crowns, the crown corporations, the appointments to the crowns, either on the board or of the CEO. I still believe that those should be non-political in nature. I don't like partisanship within it. The Conservatives are guilty of it. The Liberals are guilty of it. I mean, one of the best, I think, CEOs of Canada Post was a guy by the name of Deepak Chopra, who had come from the industry, who's now still in the industry. He understands logistics, brought private sector, brought everything that was wanted by Canada Post, and received a letter right after the election from Dominic LeBlanc saying, "We want your resignation right now." And he said, "No, I'm not going to give you my resignation because I have a contract here." Eventually he left and we lost that expertise, but that was a political decision, and it wasn't for the betterment of the Canadian institution known as Canada Post Corporation, because they then flip-flopped through various CEOs and chairs of boards, and they lost momentum during a time when they probably could have used a little bit of help in terms of getting ready for the package frenzy that we ended up getting 2 years later in Canada Post. So a pandemic rather. So for me, I am definitely on the side of having people with subject matter expertise in those positions of institutions. Now, let's talk about Pierre for a second. The Bank of Canada is inherently a government partisan kind of appointment because you appoint the board who appoints the governor, right? And you know that there's conversation.
Highly theoretically.
Oh, come on.
The finance minister picks the governor.
100%. The finance minister picks who the governor of the Bank of Canada is. No question about it. So it's a political appointment.
But that's constrained by.
Well, let me finish, Scott. Okay. If it's a political appointment, we all know that Tiff Macklem was definitely Bill Morneau's choice, and that's who he wanted, even though I like Carolyn Wilkins a lot better. I mean, so be it. So can an ex-politician come along and say, I don't like him and I'm going to fire him? Maybe he does. Maybe he can't say it. Maybe he's not crazy.
But let's not limit. Let's not reward Pierre Poilievre by saying that that's the extent of his message. That's not the extent of his message. His message is the Bank of Canada is an instrument of the Trudeau government. It is operating explicitly in a partisan fashion, and it is ruining the economic well-being of individual Canadians. It contributed to the crisis that we're in, and it's failing to get us out of it. And he condemns the entire institution as well as the governor. And I think that that's dangerous and wrong. I'll give you my example. Like, to me, you know, when I'm trying to make this distinction between people that are political but not necessarily partisan, like, I can think of lots of people that I worked with when we were at finance in particular who were on Crown Corps and who may have been refugees of the previous government, and they were appointees, particularly on boards. They were appointees of, say, the Mulroney or Campbell government, particularly Mulroney government. And I often loved to work with those people, right? Because you would, as provided they met this standard, right? People who had political acuity and could therefore recognize, you know, what the pressures and realities that had to be accommodated within the practical consequence of an institution that's inherently public. But, right, they brought they brought subject matter or private sector expertise, and they weren't just partisan. They weren't just instinctively, reflexively partisan, and they weren't anti-institutionalist. Right now, Pierre Poilievre is saying that he is an anti-institutionalist, and I think that's dangerous. And I really think that, if you degrade the institutions and say that anybody that's in charge of them is obviously acting in the harness of the sitting government, that they are de facto partisan, and that you can't trust them because they're ivory tower. Well, what happens when you take government? What are you going to do to those institutions? And be careful what you wish for, because if you're going to foul the nest, one day you'll find yourself sitting in it.
Well, the problem with Poilievre on the Bank of Canada, Lisa, surely, is that his analysis is full of shit. Like, if it was the case that Canada was the only country that had inflation, and that the bank had behaved in the way Poilievre was describing it, then they would be justified in replacing probably the governor of the Bank of Canada. But the reality is that the bank did what it needed to do to keep the economy from crashing during COVID. And every country in the world did the same thing, and now every country in the world is facing the same secondary challenge. Poilievre leaves all of that complexity out of his analysis and all counterfactuals out of his analysis, and so he comes to the wrong conclusion that the guy should be fired. But I don't think that the governor of the Bank of Canada is immune from being incompetent. I just don't think that's the case in this instance.
Or ought to be immune from scrutiny, or
Right.
possibly being replaced, But the notion that you're going to condemn.
I take that to be a not quite agreement with me.
So what you're saying is that Pierre is allowed to fire the bank governor, but he has to have good reasons, and he doesn't have good reason. And my response to that is politics. That's politics. Just
Right.
like Deepak Chopra shouldn't have been fired from Canada Post or shouldn't have been asked to leave Canada Post, but politics.
Yeah, but you got
That was a bit of a deep state argument itself. I'm remembering this just from the recesses of my mind, Lisa, but wasn't there a view on the Liberal side of the aisle that you had been intending to extend the Harper government past its defeat by a number of appointments that were made for lengthy terms in the latter stages of the government?
You know what? I wish that were even more true, because we would have a better Senate today if that were the case. Don't you think we would have went after the Senate if we were intent on keeping the legacy going? I mean, come on. We left 24 Senate appointees on the table. Blah.
Can I just say one last thought, though, and this is where I think you and I also differ, but in a distinct way, Lisa. When we get into this discussion of subject matter experts, and let's just put those people on who have no political background, I think that can often lead to big trouble. And I think that you often end up with people then, and I think there's actually some of these grenades sitting around waiting right now, because there are a lot of, people don't recognize this, but there are a lot of Crown Corps that were thrown together in the middle of the pandemic in order to achieve things that weren't as obviously achievable. And they were peopled with leadership that just came out of management consultants, right? Like, it's just management consultants from across the country, toss them in there, people who had no political acuity, no political background, thinking, well, I'm going to go in there and I'll do what's right. And what's right meant, in many respects, almost an anti-political sort of mindset. And that's going to take you into trouble, because those people actually are just like, when they put, Schmidt in charge of
it's both Macron and Draghi. It's both Macron and Draghi's problem in Europe, is that they're essentially technocrats.
Right. And you got to be careful, because you actually want people with political acuity. You just don't want them to be people who want to burn down institutions or who act like, partisans.
Look, there are some of the best small p political animals in the country are the CEOs of the major corporations and banks, because they got to manage boards and they had to make it their way through the entire bureaucracy of their own institution. So yeah, I agree. You need political acuity. You've got a master you have to report to. In our case, it's the people. And in the case of a CEO of a Crown Corp, it's their board, which is politically appointed. And if they fail...
I don't think it's the same thing always. Like, I see lots of examples of private sector CEOs that I've worked with who have this fundamental failing. They are unable to recognize that their interest is not the sole interest. And so when they are taken into, leading a Crown Corporation or a public sector institution, their inability to say, well, anything other than what I want to see done is wrong. Like I've had clashes. Like, I can remember with one major client who was affected by the income trust decision that Jim Flaherty made, freaking out and saying, I can't believe they've done this to us. And I was like, well, they're not doing it to you. You may not like the decision, but it's not inherently there to fuck you over. Like, they may have been making this decision for very valid reasons.
Yep.
Listen, I got to move on from this before I get PTSD from the Hydro One CEO and board during the 2018 provincial election in Ontario.
It's a case study, man.
Listen, there was big news in the United States last week with the support of Joe Manchin for a scaled-down version of the Build Back Better legislation. The big news for Canada was included in that bill now is a reference to North America rather than America for cars that are eligible for an environmental subsidy. This is surely a big, big win for the auto industry in Ontario. Scott, it made you feel like maybe the Trudeau government's more competent at economic measures than this panel would sometimes suggest.
It made me feel a little guilty about the sweeping condemnation I'm often accused of offering up here in terms of the government's economic management. And I just think it's worth recognizing, although I don't buy into all these TikTok stories that are like, heroic behind the scenes efforts. God, these stories drive me bananas, right? And I used to author them, to be blunt, right? Like, and I was a comms director in both the Prime Minister's office, the Finance Minister's office. I used to help author those things because you have so much control in a TikTok story because, there's only so many sources and they got to take them. They're under pressure to file. But I do think it's important to recognize the reality, which is I think a lot of us 7-8 years ago in the aftermath of the 2009 financial crisis would have said, God, man, the auto sector, that pillar of Canadian economic management, particularly in economic well-being, particularly in central Canada, it is living on life support. And I do think that the government, both in terms of the way they handled NAFTA renewal and a number of other going after electric EV vehicles, targeting it and having some success, and now having this this North American language as opposed to just Buy American language, I think they deserve credit. And I think they deserve credit for their consistency and their focus on it. And I think that I'm not going to say that they're wholly responsible for what feels like a salvaged auto sector and a potential future as an EV universe, but it feels to me like the government deserves more credit than it gets.
Lisa, when I see something like this, I mean, I'm a cynic. Right. And so I go, I'm sure they worked like the devil on it. I'm sure they contacted everybody. They worked the governors. They worked the Congress. I'm sure they worked hard. And I still have to feel that they were incidental to the outcome. Not because they're bad or just because I don't think American politicians care what the Canadian government thinks about things that are, certainly not compared to what the political implications are locally. So I've got to assume that there was a bigger factor in turning this around than the lobbying efforts of the Prime Minister and Minister Ng.
Yeah, I think two things. First of all, don't lose the forest for the trees. This EV rebate program is such a small piece of the $369 billion program that the U.S. is about to unleash on our industries. And it's going to have massive, massive implications on Canada's competitiveness. I do believe that it is important to note that we sit on critical minerals that are essential to the production of batteries, either nickel or lithium. And as a result, it's going to be really hard to leave Canada out in the cold when it comes to the reformulation and the restructuring of an auto industry. Like the entire fleet of North America is going to have to get changed over to EVs. Think about the building that's going to have to happen in the assembly. I'm sure that, the senators went to Ford and GM and said, can you guys do this actually without having some parts made in Canada or Mexico? Like, let us know what's going on here. And I'm sure they said, no, for our supply chain, we need allies. And, I think you're right, David, it's incidental. However, kudos to all the work that's been done since the 60s to make this the fact that it's an important part to American economy that Canada has these auto industries. And it's going to be great for people in the auto industry. Who it's not going to be great for are people in direct air capture or hydrogen or in any other near zero new nuclear technologies, because they are putting in such tax incentives and investment tax credits that they're going to suck all of the innovation and ingenuity straight into the United States. They are
Should we be matching them?
Play.
Should we be matching them?
I don't think we can.
We can't play that game. It's a race to the bottom that we'll lose.
I mean, carbon engineering was basically funded by the BC government in their initial days, and now they're set up in Texas. This is our new reality. So, I'll I'm very concerned about what is in this bill and what it means to Canada because of the sheer enormous size of what they're doing. Can I just say one other thing, David, on this topic, that on this bill? The Americans have said two things at the same time, which I think Canada and our politicians should take a lesson from. The first thing they said is that you are not going to be able to move forward on clean technology and clean energy without new oil and gas development. And they've made it a quid pro quo. First, you have to open up new leases on federal lands in Alaska and in Gulf of Mexico before you start giving out. You have to do that, period, before this bill goes through. And number two, if you want to open up seabed or land, federal land, to solar or wind, you have to also have already offered it to oil and gas. That's a huge statement. So what they're saying is, we're going to spend the money on our industries, try to corner some industries as well, and create the tech that's going to drive down these costs on electricity. But at the same time, we're going to look at our contribution as being this tech to the globe in terms of reducing emissions around the world, and we're going to continue to develop oil and gas. I mean, it's phenomenal what they've come up with, and congratulations to them for doing it on a bipartisan kind of point. Everybody kind of got what they wanted.
You know, I have a rare sliver of optimism, rare for me. And maybe I'm being Pollyannish and too hopeful and too optimistic, Lisa, but I do think the passage of this package, let's call it, because legislation seems like a weird word for it. I do think there is a rising tide lifting boats factor to it. And I think it will, I mean, if it helps to break us out of supply chain hell, slow and stagnant growth hell, I think that a bunch of these things about mismatch and inapplicability between one side of the border and the other side of the border, I think those things can get litigated out and managed out. But I do think the overall power of it, my hope is that it's going to lift us and it's going to boost things, and we will be a beneficiary of it, because ultimately we are a satellite of the massive economic power that is the United States. And it's nice to see them with a plan for coming back.
But on climate, you guys, I mean, how long can we continue to insist in Canada that we have to have a carbon tax and punish our oil and gas industry to meet climate change when the United States is doing the exact opposite? Effectively subsidizing gas prices and exploring for more, and on the other hand, not having any sort of carbon tax. They're doing it all through technology and technological development, at least at the national level. I know that there's other things going on in states, but there seems to be, I mean, Canadians believe one thing about climate change, which is that the United States and China are the key actors. Whatever they do is going to determine this, and we are side players in it. So how long can you convince people that we ought to be doing this here?
Yeah. So what the United States has done is they're saying they are going to fund this large package on the backs of oil and gas development, because those leases that they have to release in Alaska and the Gulf, and the leases that they want released on other federal lands, are actually going to generate revenue that's going to allow them to pay for all these tax credits. And that's what's going to spur it on. Whereas we've taken the approach in Canada where we're going to cap your emissions, or we're going to make it more difficult regulatorily. And that is a complete different approach to what's going on. And it's, I'm struggling with it. I'm struggling with and I'm optimistic too. I think for the world, what the United States is doing is remarkable. And here we are in Canada still fighting with each other about a carbon tax. Nova Scotia today, fighting about a carbon tax. You know, they want to control their emissions as opposed to implementing a carbon tax on their residents.
All right, guys, you know what? It's time for Gordon Pinsent and the Hey Yous.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, who wants to go first?
Go first, Kate Breton.
Okay, well, after my tirade last week, I thought I'd be a little bit more gentle. And oddly enough, it's going to sound strange.
Your tirade last week was so fucking great. People loved that, and I loved it.
Really loved it.
Well, thank you. I'm rarely that angry. I'm usually optimistic. But my Hey You is to small town Canada. Hey you, thanks for being you. because you're delightful. And thank God we have you out there to remind me of how awesome people are. I walked into a Tim Hortons in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, and 4 old guys were sitting there. I'm sure they don't like me calling them old, but they were. They're in their 80s. And they're having their morning coffee, discussing the world and solving all the problems of the world. And they yelled and they said, "Get over here, Lisa." I don't know who they are, but they wanted to talk politics. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So, hey, you, small town Canada, I love you. And thank goodness you're there.
Geez, that really sounds like something I should have said over the 17 years of this show.
I was going to say, what a square peg of pleasant you are in the round hole of misery and cynicism that Herle and I are. Talk about giving people something else. Well, my hey you, it doesn't have any of that positive vibe. My hey you is to Sylvia Jones, the Minister of Health in Ontario.
She's not, is she?
Well, who the hell would know? Like seriously, you cannot get. I'm going to get a load of this. I'm going to do radio all this week. I'm doing News Talk 1010 there in Bell Media. I'm going to be hosting all week. Request number 1 to get the health minister in, I'm sure has already been docketed. It will go ignored. She has not popped up. She has not had a single comment, not an appearance, not anything. No response at all to literally the burgeoning crisis that is in our health.
The deep state's in charge.
Yeah, exactly. Our hospital system, right? And you hear hospital administrators, who are not inclined to run at the government, right? A powerful government that's just reelected. It is not in your toolkit to naturally, bang the table in public and yell for something. But good grief. ERs are closing. Hospitals are forced to make the decision that they're not going to be able to accept patients. You've got massive burnout with nurses. At the lake this weekend, my cousin was telling me about all the people in the blood lab that she works who are retiring. It's just like, guys, you've got to do your job. Sylvia Jones, I don't expect you to wave a magic wand. I really don't. But at least walk up to the microphone, be on the job, respond to people, tell us what's happening, tell us what you're doing. Don't just say the federal government isn't giving us enough money. Do something, say something. It's just a massive problem that's going unaddressed, and it is literally at this point a dereliction of duty.
They have to take the salary cap off the nurses. That's crazy.
They got
the
1% things.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. All right. My hey you goes out to Western leaders, not presumptuous at all. Hey, Western leaders. Support for measures to help the Ukraine are fading in Western democracies, especially for measures that might have economic cost at home, like higher gas prices. If you want to keep supporting Ukraine, and I want you to, you need to keep communicating and persuading your populations why that is important. Otherwise, you're going to end up selling the Ukraine out because you won't have the support of your electorates for continuing the fight. So get back out there and keep making the argument about Russia and why we have to fight for Ukraine. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening this week. I'd obviously like to thank Lisa and Scott for being back here. Such a fun conversation. Thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN. All of you for listening. We'll be back next week with more Curse Politics. Till then, see you. Take care.